Hello again, my name is Steve Hillison. We're going to talk about racial and ethnic inequality in the U.S., especially focusing on recent decades. Well, let's jump right into it. We're going to be looking a whole lot at specific numbers and charts and graphs. Here we're looking at a table that shows some fairly recent Census Bureau data where we can look at the median income of various racial and ethnic groups in the United States in 2010. The median income, of course, is the income that breaks that population into equal halves. Percent of white income, what percent these various racial and ethnic minorities are making relative to whites, what percent of each group's families are living in poverty, and finally, unemployment rates. If you look at median income, you can clearly see significant differences across different racial and ethnic groups. White Americans were making over $54,600 in 2010, the median household was. But for African Americans, it was just a little over $32,000. Pretty substantial difference, to put it mildly. Hispanics, $37,759. A little more per household than African Americans, but still well below still well below white American households. On the other hand, at least one major racial minority, Asians, earn significantly more than whites. Here we're talking about $84,000 plus per household. So the larger point here is that we have tremendous variation in median income across households according to the race or ethnicity. Now, what about percent of white incomes? Well, by definitions, whites earn 100% of what whites do. What about African Americans? 59%. What about Hispanics? A little under 70%. But once again, Asians actually earn more than whites, at least when you compare households, 118%. What about percent of families in poverty? Now this data, by the way, is from 2009, it's a little older. For whites, it was slightly under 10%. For African Americans, it was a horrifying 27.4%. For Hispanics, the numbers weren't much better, 26.6%. And finally, for Asians, the percent living in poverty was actually a little higher in spite of the fact than whites, in spite of the fact that they had much higher median incomes compared to whites. Whites had, again, a poverty rate among a percentage of families in poverty, a little under 10%. For Asians, it was slightly over 12%. So Asian families were a little more likely to be in poverty than white families. How about unemployment rates? Well, once again, fairly sizable differences. Whites, 7.4% unemployment, 2012. What about African Americans? Quite a bit higher, 13.6%. What about Hispanics? A little lower, 10.5%. And finally, the lowest of all for Asians, 6.7%. The larger point here is when you look at these statistics, you clearly see very large differences between racial and ethnic minorities on a variety of kind of economic indicators. Now this is a little older data, and the only reason I'm putting this up here is not to rehash all these statistics, but rather to look at the data a little more fine detail. This allows me an opportunity to point out something about Arab Americans, a group that we did not mention earlier. Here we're looking at median family income, percent living in poverty, and percent with 4 or more years of college education. Now, we also have data there showing for the entire population, so you can kind of quickly glance and see, for example, that Arab Americans have average incomes, or I should say median family incomes, that are higher than that for the entire population. If you look at percent living in population, Arab Americans have a higher percent of people living in poverty as well, I should say as well. In spite of the fact that they have higher levels of income, they also have higher levels of poverty compared to the general population. So it's kind of a mixed story there. What about percent with 4 or more years of college education? Now here we're going to look only at people who are 25 years and older, give people time to actually have graduated. When we do, the entire U.S. population, a little over 29% have 4 or more years of college. But for Arab Americans, it's closer to 45%. So as a group, Arab Americans tend to be very well educated. Now, the chief reason I wanted to put this overhead up is to point out that there's tremendous variation within these ethnic or racial minority groups, and even for that matter within the larger white community. But let's focus now more on minority groups. For example, when we break down the Hispanic or Latino community into subgroups, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans, we see quite a bit of variation in their incomes. For example, Mexican Americans, median family income 2007, a little under $40,500. For Cuban Americans, over $52,000. This is not a small difference. Clearly Cuban Americans were doing a lot better than both Mexican Americans and Puerto Rican Americans. What about percent living in poverty? Well, we see very substantial differences there, with Puerto Ricans having the highest poverty rates at that time of 24.3%, and Cubans having the lowest rate of 13.8%. Again, old data from 2007. What about college graduation, 4 or more years, age 25 or above? Well, once again, we see very large differences. For Mexican Americans, only 8.6% had graduated with 4 or more years of college, significantly lower than the general population. The figures for Puerto Ricans were a little better, a little over 15.5%. But once again, by far the most positive results were for Cuban Americans, which was right at 25%. Now that was still a little under the national average, but you know what? It's getting very, very close. The larger point here is that you see tremendous variation within the larger Hispanic population. Now, I'm not even going to talk about the numbers for African Americans because they're not broken down to see easily on this table. But I will point out that if you want to look at recent immigrants into the United States who are black, people from Jamaica, other parts of the kind of Caribbean region, some from Africa. If you look at recent black immigrants into the United States, you're going to find out that there's tremendous variation between that group of people and native-born Americans, people who've been here for generations, or at least their forebears were here for generations. Again, if you wanted to pull those numbers apart, you could find out that recent immigrants who are black tend to have higher incomes, lower rates of unemployment, higher levels of education compared to native-born Americans. Moving on, Asian Americans. Now, Asian Americans as a group do tremendously well in America, but nevertheless, when you break the Asian community down into subpopulations, you do see significant variation between those subpopulations. Here we're looking at median family income, again 2007. Chinese Americans, 78,000 plus. Japanese Americans, 88,000 plus. And finally, kind of pulling up from behind, Korean Americans still doing pretty well, but noticeably not as well as some other Asian groups, bringing home a little under 64,000. We see quite a bit of variation in poverty rates. Japanese having fairly low poverty rates, Chinese noticeably higher, and Koreans a little higher still. And then we look at education. Well, we could talk a little bit about variation, and there is variation. Korean Americans are actually the most likely, have the highest percentage of people with 4 or more years of education for those 25 and older. Actually, noticeably higher than Japanese and even higher than Chinese. But the one thing I want to point out here is the one thing that these Asian groups share with each other, which is very impressive, very high levels of education. And Native Americans, another group that we didn't mention. In many respects, Native Americans, in terms of their economic and educational profiles, are very similar to Hispanics and also similar to African Americans. Below average incomes, higher percentages living in poverty, and lower percentages having graduated from college compared to the general population. Now, this graph will give us just a little sense of how persistent many of these kinds of statistics have been. Here we're looking at median household income from 1959 to 2010. Actually, I have to be careful, this only goes from 1967 to 2010. At any rate, you can see that Asian Americans have been, well, as long as they're providing us with the statistics, they've been kind of leading the pack. That curve is higher, suggesting higher household incomes. And you can see that white non-Hispanics have been doing fairly well for a long time. And you can also see that blacks and Hispanics have not done as well. So this is showing us that, actually a couple things, it's showing us very persistent patterns of inequality across racial and ethnic groups. The gaps don't disappear. They change a little bit, but they don't disappear. Some groups on top, some groups below them. But it also shows upward trends across these racial and ethnic groups, which is showing increasing median household incomes, which is a good thing. Obviously, we're seeing improvements in median income across groups. And we don't necessarily have to look at every statistic, but let's look at another one. Here we're looking at poverty rates for Hispanics, Asians, whites, blacks, 1980 to 2009. African Americans and Hispanics for a long time have had much higher rates of poverty compared to Asians and whites. And again, you can tell that these are very persistent differences. But even there, again, there is some good news, which is that if you look at the long-term trends, at least with Hispanics and with Hispanics and blacks, you'll see a clear downward trend from 1980 to 2009. Now, we're going to point out that there's been some things that have happened since then that have been a little more discouraging, not quite so positive. Change in the number of children in poverty between 2007 and 2010, broken down by race, ethnicity, and nativity. In other words, whether parents and or children were born in the United States. Now this comes from Pew Research Center, and what we can do is compare figures from 2007 in this column and 2010 in this column, and then look at the percentage change over here from 2007 to 2010. In order to speed things up, I'm just going to look at the percentage changes. Not surprisingly, as we move from 2007 to 2010, we're passing through the Great Recession, and you would expect child poverty rates to increase, and they did. They increased across groups. A 17.6% increase among whites, a somewhat smaller increase among African Americans, 11.7%, still very large, and finally a massive increase among Hispanics in terms of child poverty rates, 36.3%, very large increase. Now let's break down the Hispanic population so that we can distinguish between people who were born in the U.S. and people who weren't. In this case, we're going to look at children of immigrant parents and then children of U.S. born parents. And we're going to notice some fairly sizable differences there. Even with Hispanic kids who have parents who were born in the U.S., we still see very high child poverty rates, 31.1%, still much higher than other racial and ethnic groups, and abysmally high just on its own, kind of in its own right. But when we look at children who are Hispanic and whose parents were immigrants into the U.S., the numbers are even more disturbing, 39%, well over a third of those kids are in poverty.